a group of American cybersecurity analysts at a company called Eyesight Partners found that this piece of malware called Black Energy was being used for, they thought, spying on targets across NATO, Eastern Europe, and also the United States. But as they and other cybersecurity analysts looked deeper, it seemed to be a kind of reconnaissance for cyber attack, for bridging a digital-physical divide, for starting to mess with the controls of things like water systems, like the electric grid. When that was exposed, this group of hackers, who Eyesight had named Sandworm, essentially went to ground and didn't reappear for another year. A year after Sandworm was first spotted doing those reconnaissance attacks across Europe and the West, it reappeared and now was fully in attack mode. And it hit the Ukrainian railway, it hit the Kiev airport, it hit a series of media companies, and it was using a kind of data-destroying tool called Kill Disk. In December of 2015, just a couple of days before Christmas, 3 Ukrainian power utilities were hit with not only Kill Disk, but also a far more insidious attack. In the hardest hit of these 3 Ukrainian power utilities, Prikopatya Oblenergo, the hackers had in fact used a whole arsenal of attacks. They used Kill Disk to wipe all the machines, a barrage of phone calls against the company to overwhelm their phone systems. They attacked the backup power supply for the utility itself, so that when they triggered the blackout, even the utility was thrown into darkness. And then finally, when they did trigger that blackout, they did it in this very haunting fashion by taking over the actual mouse movements of some of the operators and locking them out of their computers so that the operators were watching as their own mouse cursor was clicking through circuit breakers, turning them off one by one, cutting the power to, whole swaths of the country. The first Ukrainian blackout was an entirely unprecedented event in the history of cybersecurity, and it offered an opportunity to say to Russia and its state-sponsored hackers like Sandworm, this is not okay, this is not something we, as a kind of global society, will tolerate. You can't attack the infrastructure of civilians in this indiscriminate way. But nobody exactly said that, and the United States certainly didn't, and the opportunity was missed in a way. We never drew that red line. We were very distracted by another Russian cyber attack, in fact a series of them, not Sandworm, instead called Fancy Bear, had infiltrated the Democratic National Committee in a kind of influence operation designed to meddle in the US election and help elect Donald Trump. Even as the Obama administration was actually rebuking the Kremlin for its election hacking, they didn't mention the Ukrainian blackout. That was a missed opportunity, and I think it telegraphed to Putin and to the Kremlin they could test whatever cyber war capabilities they wanted in Ukraine. So then in late 2016, just after the election of Donald Trump, another wave of Russian cyber attacks hit Ukraine. This second wave of attacks was even more destructive than the first. One cybersecurity analyst, Marina Krotofield, described it to me as, in the first case, there was a bunch of street thugs who were kind of just smashing everything. And in this case, they were ninjas. They weren't clicking through circuit breakers with a hijacked mouse. They used this piece of code that did it automatically. In Destroyer, or Crash Override, was the first ever automated blackout tool. At a push of a button, can, like a machine gun, hit all of the circuit breakers at the utility. And that's what happened. You don't build a tool like this just to use it once. You build it as a kind of repeatable attack that you can drop somewhere else and it will cause a blackout again. Russian hackers were experimenting with new techniques in Ukraine, and it had become their kind of test lab for cyber war. In June of 2017, a worm hit in the country called NotPetya. There was an incredibly destructive automated worm that spread from machine to machine. Practically the entire national internet of Ukraine was shut down within hours. And that includes banks, the railway system, airports, every government agency, tons of Ukrainian companies, Ukrainian hospitals, all essentially had no computers. But It didn't end there. A worm doesn't recognize national borders. The world's largest shipping firm, Maersk, FedEx, the pharmaceutical company Merck, all suffered hundreds of millions of dollars of damages. For Maersk, for instance, that meant that 17 of their terminals in ports around the world ceased operation. Massive ships covered in tens of thousands of shipping containers were pulling into ports around the world, and they couldn't be unloaded. Tens of thousands of trucks are lining up outside of these ports because the terminal gates were frozen shut. A fifth of the world's entire shipping capacity was frozen on the spot and would not recover for weeks. The White House estimated that NotPetya did at least $10 billion of damage. That's by far the biggest cyber attack in history. The Russian attacks on Ukraine that the United States and the West have been willing to ignore for so long because they were kind of someone else's faraway problem were no longer far away. They were everywhere at once. It was clear to forensic investigators in the private sector almost immediately that NotPetya was linked with these blackout attacks in Ukraine, that it was all the work of this group under the larger banner of Sandworm. Another thing that came to light around the same time is that a series of American power grid targets had also been breached by Russian hackers. Finally, in early 2018, the US, Australia, New Zealand, Britain, and Canada together issued this rebuke of Russia, naming NotPetya not only as a Russian cyber weapon, but attributing it to a very certain agency, the Russian military intelligence agency known as the GRU. The GRU was the same agency responsible for Fancy Bear, the hackers who had meddled in the US election. There was forensic evidence tying all these attacks together. Eventually, it became clear that Sandworm and Fancy Bear were essentially two sides of the same coin. They were both just parts of the GRU, and it showed that the GRU was, in fact, so brazenly hacking the world in multiple respects, not just with these kind of influence operations, but in these acts of direct, massive sabotage. I think there's very little question that the NSA and Cyber Command, the kind of more offensive arm of US hacking forces, are even more sophisticated than Russia's hackers in the GRU. But they're also very restrained by law and by our kind of American values, whereas the GRU seems willing to do literally anything. If we look at the whole arc of the GRU's activity, specifically from those first Sandworm operations starting in 2009 up until the attacks in Ukraine and the first blackout, Fancy Bear's attacks on the US election, and then NotPetya, this massive climactic attack and the aftershocks of it that followed, we're watching this group escalate its attacks and evolve them. And as we approach the 2020 election and beyond, there's really no reason to think that this is over.
Hey, NBC.